Hello, thank you so much for joining me once again. So, a lot of you may have noticed, Culture Japan released a whole bunch of new free patterns. They actually did go through and they made the old patterns have English on them as well, which is very nice, though it does make them a little bit less of a puzzle for me. I'm sure you appreciate it, though. It does make things a lot easier to read if you, like me, only speak English. So, I have gone ahead and made a video with the tie front shirt, and I think it turned out really cute. I do have two versions. One was my first attempt, one was my second attempt after I kind of figured out how I liked to put it together. And I am hoping to get the other free patterns out. I've actually made two of them. The Beer Girl dress and the summer schoolgirl uniform are already made. I just need to edit that footage, and whoo boy, it's gonna be long. But I'm excited. I hope you are too, and we're gonna jump back in time super quick to analyzing this pattern. Hello again. So there have been some new free patterns, and I figured that was a good enough excuse to maybe start trying to make videos again. It's been a while. There's a lot of reasons, health reasons, both big and small. Though the big ones didn't turn out to be too big, thank goodness. We moved again, work, just so many things. But I'm still here, I'm still thinking about stuff, and I'm thinking this looks like a fun pattern to start with. It's on the smaller side compared to some of them, and it looks like something we could get and do. Everything's in English, which is kind of amazing. That actually makes things a lot easier. I think to start with, I'm gonna go through and tell you what I can read from these pattern pieces and what they mean. This is not a pattern piece, this was just a little kind of note on construction, which I thought was useful, so we're going to keep that handy. And yeah, we're going to go through, we'll start with the body, and it looks like this is back center, back center. We've got our circle showing us that it is the center. We've got these little arrow marks that are showing us the grain line. We have this, which I don't 100% know what that is. I'm almost wondering if it's marking down on the pattern. I just don't know. I'm not 100% sure what that means. These little zigzags, I think those mean to surge. But I don't know, because it's not 100% sure on that one either. These very faint zigzags, or not zigzags, dotted or dashed lines are top stitching indicators. This is the center back, and then this is the center back yoke, but it also, I believe, goes over because we've got NP and SP marked here, and I don't know what those stand for, but from previous patterns I do think those are shoulder line markers. So instead of having your shoulder seam, they've moved the seam down, and then they've sort of marked where the top of the shoulder is with these two markers. So that's nice. This is the front, and it's gonna connect like that to our back at the side seam. And then this is the tie, which there's kind of a lot going on here. We also have our grain lines on the tie, which is nice. We have the actual tie part. It does tell us to cut 4, so I'm thinking this is where our little note comes in, because it says main and facing. So what it's telling me is that on the front side of the fabric, this seam allowance gets turned like you would with a normal seam allowance, but the facing stays open, and then is top stitch, is probably serged and then top stitched down. I'm sorry if you can hear Snowy. He sounds so upset, but I promise the only thing he's mad about is the fact that I'm not sitting on the couch for him right now. And he can hear me in here. He's so pitiful. Oh, baby. So after this, I'll take a break and go cuddle him, I promise. But okay, so that's kind of our body. And then we have the collar, which is kind of a really cool piece. It's got the collar part, and then it also has the rise of the collar built in. And then it has you fold it, and this is definitely to reduce bulk in the collar area because it's kind of a smaller piece, and with everything going towards the inside, it's going to be very bulky if we didn't do that. And then we have the sleeve. The sleeve, 3-fold turn. Oh, maybe that's what that is. Yes. That's probably what that is. So instead of serging, it's a 3-fold turn, which means basically a hem. So we would fold this and then fold this, and then it would lay nice and flat, and then you top stitch over it. Okay, I bet that's what that means, 3-fold turn. Cool. And then we have front and back markers. Excellent. We have this all tuck and gather. So you both tuck it and gather it, which is really interesting. I've not seen that before, but a tuck is exactly as it's shown here. You know, sort of like a pleat, it's sometimes called. So that would be tucked, and then you would also run a gathering stitch and gather it down a little bit. So tuck and gather 2.5 centimeters up. So I'm assuming that means that you would gather all of this, or you'd tuck it first and then you would gather it down to 2.5 centimeters. That's kind of my guess. It wants you to stitch here for some reason. Not 100% sure on that. But that's pretty much it. So first thing first, we gotta cut all of the pieces out. And it is good form to cut your pieces out with the paper facing up, or like with this piece, my paper is facing down, but the pattern piece is also flipped, or the fabric is also flipped. That just, if there is something that is supposed to be on the right side or supposed to be on the left side, like if you have an asymmetrical design, that helps you keep everything straight so you're cutting stuff in a way that will fit together again later. Though there's things where it doesn't matter as much, and you will probably note that I get pretty flippant about it. But in this case, it is a symmetrical pattern, so it's not a huge deal. The reason that my pieces are sometimes upside down is because I actually fold them along the center line or the grain line to find perfect grain with my stripes. And I find that with stripe stuff especially, it's a really good way to keep everything lined up in a way that I have a much harder time doing in other ways, basically. Though you can tell I'm cutting 2 pieces out at a time in some of these cases, and I'm not being too careful. But as we go along, this is my first attempt at this. I do make a few mistakes, all stuff that's fixable really, but also things that are annoying. So I actually did remake this immediately after, and I recorded that too. So if you would prefer to see the mistake-free version, skip ahead. I'll try to put something up on here when I know when that is, but otherwise just keep on watching and see the kind of mistakes that I make when I overthink things. now I am setting up all of my pieces and basically taking inventory. I do struggle deeply with my fabric pencil, which has decided, or my fabric pen, which has decided that it's not gonna work. Like, I can get it to work on paper for 2 seconds, but it won't draw on fabric for anything. So I eventually give up and actually clip my notches. A lot of people hate this. I'm kind of indifferent towards it because it does work. I tend to only clip my notches in like 1/8 of an inch. I make them as shallow as possible so that I don't run the risk of cutting through my seam line. And I don't know, I'm actually getting kind of fond of it. I do eventually purchase some other marking options and give those a try, but for the most part, clipping them is so much faster. And on the sleeve here, you can see I am clipping the pleats. I eventually decided I like clipping the gather lines better, because this does have you pleat and gather, but I tended to not need to gather after I did the pleating, like it was down to the measurement indicated. But I do think you could probably make it a little bit shorter. So I don't know, they're sleeves. You can make sleeves almost any length. Oh, I did mark the front of the sleeves because I did notice that they are not symmetrical, so that's worth noting. And I'm marking on the yoke here. You can see there's little marks with the line and the circle on the end. Those are the shoulder lines because the yoke actually covers both part of the back and the front. But yeah, that's about it. And then now we are pinning things to actually sew them. So the first thing I did was pinned the yoke to the back because that will need to be sewn at, I think it was 5 millimeters, and then I finished it with serging and top stitched it. You could also just zigzag it or use fray check or whatever, but I do recommend the top stitching because of course that does show. This is part where I make a mistake. I actually started doing it correctly, where I had the tie front and I was pinning it to the side front, but then I changed my mind and pinned the facing of the tie front to the tie. This works, but it does make things a little bit harder going forward. My cat is very confused about the fact that I'm talking. For once, the cats actually can come into the recording studio at will, and so now Dottie is in my lap purring, but also very confused about me talking. But anyway, so I set those aside, and then I start setting up the sleeves. I like to do things in batches, you know, do as much setup as I can and then do more sewing, all the sewing I can, and vice versa. It makes projects go faster. So that's kind of what we're doing here. I'm trying to figure out how best to do the pleats. I think the pleat is supposed to face up on the front. It is very much just, oh no, I did them facing down, looks like. It's very much your personal preference. I don't even know what I don't have this official product, so I can't look closely enough to see which direction they're going, so follow your heart. And then I am going to do gathering lines on those, just to tack the pleats down and then also to gather later. Then the collar, you fold in half the long way. This first collar piece, I didn't really mark the sewing lines and I kind of regretted it, so I do fix that in the next version. Okay, now we're back from the sewing machine, and this is lining up the yoke with the side fronts, or the front pieces. It's real easy to line up just because of how the pieces are cut. And these, like the back, you want to sew at 5 millimeters and then finish with the serging or zigzagging or fray check and then top stitch. And and I top stitch them with the seam allowance facing up towards the shoulders. And now I have my tie front, or the tie front slash facing piece. I'm just snipping all of my corners and edges and making sure that I can turn this right side out. It is a little difficult to turn right side out. I ended up using that dead pen because I couldn't fit my finger in it. So find yourself a chopstick or a pen or some kind of long, thin, but not too pointy tool. And then I start doing the same with the collar piece. I trim all of the long seam allowances and I clip into the little corner and turn everything right side out. Try to get it all nice and lined up. This is one that you're definitely going to want to press. And if I absolutely have to, I do use a pin to dig the corner out a little bit more. Not my favorite way to do it because you can damage the fabric, but it's still something I do, so I can't be too critical of it. And that's just kind of playing with the color to see how it will eventually look. These are my my gathering threads, and so I did gather these down just a tiny bit, and I feel like I probably could have gathered them more if I really wanted to, but I did eventually, I think, give up and tie one end of the gathering so that it would stay, because when I was gathering so little it seemed like it just wanted to ungather itself. So I actually tied both ends to keep it gathered. And you can see what I'm doing is basically picking one of the stitches so that the thread will come out on the same side as the other thread so that I can just tie them together in a knot. Supposedly you're not supposed to do that. I don't know why. It works, and in my books, if it works, it's not wrong. So I guess there's caveats to that. If it actually like hurts somebody, then yeah, it's wrong. But in sewing, generally, unless you've accidentally stabbed yourself, there's not a lot of injuries. Well, the iron. Don't mess around with irons. I don't know if you can tell, but I'm definitely a little bit rusty at this whole YouTube thing, so I do apologize. We're getting a little rambly. Oh yeah, there is that dotted line on the collar piece I just pointed out, and I do stitch along that. I don't know if that's a fold line or if you're actually supposed to stitch it. It didn't look bad, so I did it. Oh, not a problem. Now I'm discovering why I kind of regretted putting that facing piece on first, because it did make this seam where I'm putting the tie to the front a little bit more difficult because it wanted to curl in on itself where it had been sewn. Okay, now that I have sewn the ties to the front, I realized that it would be good to trim down that seam a little bit so that it lays flat. That'll all get top stitched down eventually, but you still don't want a whole lot of bulk in there. Then I'm showing off the stitching line I did along that fold line and trimming the other side. I guess we're jumping around a bit today. Then for the sleeves, I am going to pin those into the sleeve cap now, and I do use that little notch mark to match up with the center of the sleeve, and it matched up really good, so I'm pretty confident that's what that's there for. The other notches actually did pretty well match up with the stitching lines of the yoke too, so that's worth keeping in mind. This actually fit in absolutely beautifully, even though the arm side on the bodice part looks a little strange, it works just fine. I didn't have any trouble with it. And once that is sewn on, I'm just checking my pattern pieces again, and here I've noticed, oh hey, that's another stitching line. So I guess for these sleeves, for whatever reason, instead of having the seam allowance go towards the sleeve like it usually does, they want you to press it towards the body of the bodice and then top stitch it. So I do go and I actually serged the edge first, and then I went and top stitched that down. And once that's done, now we can add the collar. Because I did that one top stitching line in the center, the collar doesn't flip open as easily, so that was something I do change going forward. But in the meantime, it is pretty simple to line it up with the edge of the bodice and then your notch marks. They all lined up really nicely. I mean, no surprises. These are industrial patterns that were used to make a ton of products. Of course, they're all matched up nice. I do find it nice and easy to trim that collar edge a little bit just to get all the little confusing strings out of the way. Obviously you don't want to trim too much, but I did snip into the collar just a tiny bit to relieve some tension so that it will go through the machine a little bit easier. And now I'm just kind of fussing until I get it just right. This part is a bit fiddly because it's on the smaller side, but once it's sewn, I take the... Actually, I sewed it only to the outside collar piece. Now, I'm so sorry it's out of frame. It's so easy to forget to stay in frame. But I'm just trimming the seam allowances a little bit right now, and then I go in and fold, oh yeah, now you can kind of see, fold the inside of the collar up so that all of the seam allowance is all kind of trapped inside. And you can actually just hand stitch this for a completely invisible seam, but I do go ahead and stitch in the ditch along the base of the collar and sew it down like that. I do initially pin things vertically on the inside, but then I go back on the outside and I put in horizontal pins just to catch the very edge, and I fiddle with that a bit actually. I think I turned the camera off, or I think the camera battery died, but I do fiddle with that a bit before I do my top stitching or my stitching in the ditch, and that really does help make finishing the collar in that way a little bit easier. Now I'm just doing up the side seams and the sleeves. You can see how those gathers and pleats kind of curved the arm in an interesting way. Make sure that your cuffs edges line up with the edge of the sleeve. It looks like they won't, but I promise it will. It gives it a little bit extra width at the top of the cuff, and that just makes the cuff sit nicer on the doll eventually. So this is basically put together. The only thing that we need to do now is our top stitching, and there's quite a bit of top stitching to do all along the front tie piece to hold the facing down, and then also along the collar piece just for the aesthetics of it. And then the last bit is to fold up the bottom hem and sew the top stitch. Is kind of top stitching, it's kind of having sew that in place. And once that's all done, everything sits nice and flat, and it's time to finally put it on our doll. So the fit is absolutely beautiful, of course. It fits like a glove. this one does fit larger busts better than the small default bust. And I have to admit, my personal preference is to have something underneath it, because otherwise it does show an awful lot of cleavage. Which, you know, if that's your thing, that's your thing, but it's not mine. So I do really like how this looks. I think the blue and white stripes with the pink is actually really cute. I think the blue and white stripes on this pattern in general is really cute. But I knew I needed to do this pattern again just because it was such a rough go around. There were so many things I regretted or thought I needed to do differently. So here we go again. I grabbed some different fabric. This stuff has it's cream colored with some really cute subtle floral prints on it, and I thought this might be a neat contrast to see the different ways of styling. Once again, I start with the back and the yoke, and I pin those together. Now I am going to pin the front tie with the front on both sides, matching up the notches. And occasionally I do go in and just snip a little bit into the seam allowance just to make it lay a little bit nicer while it goes through the machine. Then we snag our collar, fold that in half, and I do draw in the stitching line because it's kind of unique and it just made it a lot easier. I ended up using, well, I tried to use my old pens. Didn't work very good. I just could not get it to write hardly at all. The struggle was real. I eventually gave up and started trying on the other side too. It sort of kind of works. I end up switching to friction pens at some point, and people don't like them because if you get the item really cold, the markings will come back because it's heat erase. That doesn't really bother me. I've never had them reappear when it was inconvenient. I don't take my dolls out for cold photo shoots very often, I guess. But yeah, we're moving on to the sleeves. We're doing those little pleats, and I am measuring out to make sure that they become as small as they need to. Honestly, the important part with these little pleats is consistency. Alright, so now that my little pleats have been tacked down, I go in and fold up the cuff, and then I'm going to iron that. They're not really shoulder seams. The front gets pinned to the yoke, and then I'm going to sew that. And then I start trimming off the excess seam allowance in the collar because it's a tiny piece and it's just not gonna fit in there. So I do my best to get that all cleaned up nicely without clipping through any of my stitching lines. And it takes a little bit of finagling with a pin, which unfortunately I have to look closely at, and so I take it closer to my face and then it gets pulled off of camera. Basically, I'm glad that I marked those stitching lines. I do think that it made the end collar a lot more precisely shaped, which is a good thing. I did go ahead and sew the yoke to the front, and then I serged it, top stitched it. Now we are adding the sleeves to the bodice, and you can see I have with the pin I've marked the front again of the sleeve so that I make sure that my sleeves are facing the correct direction, because these are not symmetrical sleeves. And I just go in and finagle and pin those so that they will sit nicely. I know I've mentioned it before, when I sew sleeves I do prefer to sew with the sleeve facing down, and that just, for me, for whatever reason, makes it easier for me to avoid puckers while I'm sewing. Of course it is a slow process and you need to be careful as you go along, just because it is a tight curve and two different curves, which always makes things interesting. Honestly though, these sleeves do fit together really, really nicely. Fit into the arm side really nicely. I like that. Now we are going to close up our side seams and of course close up the sleeves in the process. Make sure that your cuff is folded up and that all of your raw edges are lined up together. The cuff is just a tiny bit wider than the raw edge of the sleeve at the top, and you want them to line up so that you have a little bit of extra space at the top of the cuff. That just helps it sit nicer around the round arm. Something I've noticed in a lot of the Culture Japan patterns, they actually do accommodate for that, and it makes for really nice results. So now we're doing the same thing with the other side, and we're gonna sew and serge that. I also serged the bottom because that will need to be finished later, but before then we're gonna pin our facing of the ties to the tie front and sew around that with the indicated seam allowance, which I believe in this case was 5 millimeters. Once that has been sewn, we are going to trim that seam allowance down because we want to get rid of the extra bulk. I'm also going to be trimming off and cutting notches into the seam allowance of the tie itself so that when we put everything right side out, there won't be extra bulky fabric getting in the way. And we do the same thing for the other side. It is important to make sure that you don't accidentally cut your stitching line, because then you will have to go back and re-sew it. Otherwise you'll have a hole in your fabric. Or rather, a hole in your seam. And that's no good. Once all of our trimming has been done, we're going to go in and put everything right side out. I use that pen that is barely working and a pin just to kind of pull that extra edge. I like using dead pens for poking corners in fabrics like this because they tend to be pokey enough to get in there, but also not so pokey that they shred your fabric. It's just a preference, I don't know. It's not necessary. Some people use chopsticks. There's pretty much anything you can find laying around you can use. I am going in, trimming down those seam allowances to make sure everything lays under the facing nicely, and we're gonna go and turn the other tie right side out. And once that's done, I do go ahead and top stitch all along both ties and also hem up the back of the bodice. Like you can see, I'm pinning it up here, and I just do a single fold hem on that. So now all that's left is the collar piece, which we are going to use our notches to line up nicely, and the edges of the collar are going to line up real nicely with the edges of our tie pieces. I do like to go in and get all those little fuzzies trimmed out of the way again, just because they sort of obscure the edge of the fabric when you're working this precisely, and yeah, it can get in the way. So I do just put a few snips into the seam allowance of the back bodice there so that things will lay flat while I'm sewing, and go ahead and sew that on just the outside piece. And we are going to fold in the inside, or the lining. Is it a lining? It's not really a lining. Well, we're going to fold the other side of the collar under so that we can hide all of those ugly seam allowances. I will be stitching in the ditch to hold this down again, and as you can see, I'm putting my pins in horizontally from the side of the fabric that I plan to be sewing on. So this just helps me make sure everything on the underside of the fabric is nice and lined up the way it should be. I had to take a break for a second there. I don't remember what happened, but I am going to go in and do the top stitching around the rest as well at the same time. And yeah, now this tie front is done. So we'll go ahead and put this one on. You can see the results are identical to the previous tie front, but this one went together a lot smoother. It just goes to show that the order that you sew things in can really affect how easily it is to do. I do tend to try a whole bunch of things before I settle on a final method. I would say this is a pretty good final method. I didn't really struggle with any of the steps doing it this way. I didn't feel like I had to backtrack anything. So yeah, this is the tie front top from Culture Japan. Like I said before, it's a really cute top. It fits absolutely beautifully. I do prefer it with some kind of sports bra or something underneath it, just for my personal aesthetics. And yeah, thank you so much for joining me. I'm gonna try to get more of these Culture Japan pattern instructions out. I know people do like them quite a bit, and I have ideas for other videos. I don't know when I'll be able to do them, but I will do my best. Please do like and subscribe if you like this kind of content. I would be more than happy to have you here. So I hope you guys have a good day, and I'll see you again soon. Bye.